have Dan back, and he came last year to talk about his book, A Salem Witch, which I highly, highly recommend. It is one of the most readable books that I have read about the Salem Witch Trials, and it's the only biography about one person within the witch hysteria in Salem. So Dan Gagnon serves on the board of directors of the Rebecca Nurse Homestead Museum in Danvers, Massachusetts, formerly known as Salem Village. He received a BA in history from Providence College and an MA in history from Boston College. He also does Salem Village historical walking tours, and he has some dates in October that are still available coming up. And if you're interested in a walking tour of historic sites in Danvers, which was Salem Village associated with the witch hysteria, please see Dan after the presentation. So we're excited to welcome Dan. He will be signing books at the end, and books are for sale in the bookstore. So thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you. It's nice to see you this evening. Thank you for coming out. I hope that I can be heard. Okay, I hope the microphone is working. Yep. Oh, there it is. Good. So this evening, I am happily back again to talk about the 1692 witch hunt with a little bit of a different topic. Last time I was here, as Lynn had mentioned, I was talking primarily about my book, a biography of Rebecca Nurse. That was not the first, it was not the first topic that I had researched and had given talks locally about. The first one was actually about George Jacobs, one of the other victims of the Salem Village witch hunt, and my research into actually really comparing the two of them, how George Jacobs, what happens to him during the witch hunt, and how he's remembered after, which is really the crux of it, and then also Rebecca Nurse, what happened to her during the witch hunt and how she's remembered after. So tonight we're focusing on the George Jacobs part, since I've already talked about Rebecca Nurse, and the George Jacobs part is fascinating in that he's somebody that's often overlooked. His grave is in the cemetery of the Rebecca Nurse homestead. And you can see when he's reburied, 1992, but he's got a great stone that looks like the 1600s, very well done, looks good, appropriate. And when in my time volunteering at the Rebecca Nurse homestead, one of my projects was doing some work in the cemetery. We had the entire cemetery restored, gravestones put back together, some that had been in the cellar of the barn for like 50 years. We figured out from old photos where they belonged, where they went. And so I spent a lot of time in the cemetery, more than previously. And what caught my eye was, as I was taking some photos, is you got George Jacobs here. His nice stone, 1992. And then you look up to the top, and really overshadowing him is the monument to Rebecca Nurse that was also put up more than a century before. Both of these people were innocent of witchcraft in 1692. How are they remembered so differently? How is Nurse presumably, buried there, and then a monument to her just a couple generations later, while George Jacobs, his remains, are treated in a very different way, and not necessarily the most respectfully until his 1992 burial. And I wanted to kind of investigate their families. What led to this difference was my question. So I broke this into 3 parts. I had written this as a journal article, so it's very structured in a certain sense. What caused the disparity in memorialization, their time during the witch hunt, and then the real meat of it is how they're memorialized after 1692. My overall comparison is we have a lot of similarities. We have that they are socioeconomic background is pretty similar. They're both farmers in what is today the town of Danvers, the same area, not super far apart from one another. Both of them maintain their innocence. They said, I am innocent, in actually some kind of similar language even. They have some similar quotes. When people first started writing about the witch hunt and really publishing about it is the 1800s, which is why it says the 19th century. They were both positively portrayed. This is the era when they built that monument to Rebecca Nurse. So if they were both positively portrayed, you kind of think both would have gotten one, all being equal. They have a real physical legacy, and here George Jacobs actually kind of pulls ahead. He has a stronger physical legacy in a sense. His descendants knew where he was buried. It wasn't really marked, but they knew where he was buried. His canes are in the collection of what was the Essex Institute, now the Peabody Essex Museum. He's described as always walking with two canes. He is older at that point. He's in his mid-80s by the time he's accused of witchcraft. We have sometimes different years written for his age in that we don't have really a document of when he was born. But typically he's chalked up to being about at 85, 86, so really the mid-80s. And moreover, in the late 1800s, his family is still living on his farm, whereas Rebecca Nurse's family had actually already sold the farm. They later built a memorial in the cemetery, but they weren't actually really still living there, at least not with the last name Nurse. So you think from this comparison, he's the one that's more likely to be remembered. He's the one who's probably going to get a memorial on his farm where his however many greats descendants live. So what is our difference? What is our difference? Some of the things I looked into is gender, of course. One is a man, one is a woman. How does this play into memorialization? How does this play into how they're remembered? The Salem witch hunt is interesting in that compared to other New England witch hunts, other Old England witch hunts, we do have a surprisingly high proportion of men accused. It is still the majority women in Salem in 1692 who are accused, but it's actually a higher percentage of men than similar events in history. So we have our statistics of these for about a century. It's about 78% during that time period were women, clearly overwhelmingly. Now, in later times, you have historians who portray this as women being oppressed, quite clearly. Yeah, absolutely. And we have books like this written in 1893, Women, Church, and the State. That's really a instrumental book that really describes these early women as witches, so-called, who the local authorities, the local congregational church is trying to suppress. After this book, that could have given Rebecca Nurse an advantage. That we have this new movement that kind of links in with the movement for women's suffrage, this new burgeoning women's movement in America, that this is something that many of these leaders would have read. But that actually comes out after Nurse's monument is already built. That is not how they saw Rebecca Nurse in 1885. This idea hadn't been spread yet. So that doesn't actually give her the advantage here. One thing, as it is October, you have to talk about tourism, and is there an economic gain here between the two families of building a memorial or not building a memorial? The answer is really no. Back in 1885, when they put up Rebecca Nurse's monument, there really isn't Salem tourism in any way that you'd be making money. And again, this is out in Salem Village, that's now Danvers. There is absolutely zero money to be made in this such of a thing. It's just so far out from downtown Salem. And even Salem, I have a little guidebook here. This is from an original that the Rebecca Nurse Homestead actually has. Some of these early Salem guidebooks, they really don't even emphasize the witch hunt much. They're really talking about maritime stuff. They're talking about literature like Hawthorne. So there's no tangible gain from how these two people are remembered. What I zeroed in on is the one difference we see is how their families reacted after they're accused of witchcraft. That is where we kind of start to see a divide. So it's nothing about them. It's nothing that they did that causes this difference. It's how their family reacted. So here we have the Nurse family, which is really the best example of a family that sticks up for their family member. They gather stacks and stacks of documents to present at her trial. They have dozens of witnesses, people signing petitions, 39 neighbors signing a petition of Rebecca Nurse's good character, who are therefore sticking out their own necks to defend somebody accused of witchcraft. There is no family stronger than that and more united in her defense out of all the people who are accused of witchcraft. She is the best defense. By contrast, you have George Jacobs' family. He, when accused, is just as strong, stating that he is innocent. He could not be more unequivocal about that. The problem is his granddaughter is going to turn on him after he's accused and testify against him. Something that doesn't happen in Nurse's family. She is going to falsely confess that she also is a witch. Really, as we'll see, it's kind of peer pressure. She's a young woman, a late teenager. And that is kind of going to be a black mark on the Jacobs legacy here. With the two and their time leading up to the witch hunt, I made a little Google map out of sites related to the Salem Village witch hunt. So the red is the red, not really a rectangle, is the farm where the Nurse family lived. Next to our red triangle, below the word Crane River, that's not George Jacobs' land, actually, but his is right next to it. So his farm is down there. So they aren't terribly far apart by any means. Nurse is, of course, born in England, comes over here, lives in Salem Village. I got our more historic map, our 19th century map. And you can see here that George Jacobs there's a number 142 in the North Fields. And the Nurse family farm is, again, not quite a rectangle. It's where the giant letter D is, the way it kind of comes about. With our event, I already mentioned we have men and women accused. These are our numbers. We have at least 172 accused. It's usually said by historians as like almost 200. We know we don't have every piece of paper from 1692. There are probably other pieces of paper or accusations that have just been lost. But we know it's at least 172. You can have 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, at least 5 die in the awful, awful jails. And they're all innocent. The crime they're accused of is impossible, that they actually had a little meeting with the devil. They signed an employment contract to work for the devil, and the devil gave them special powers to afflict and hurt people and try to destroy Massachusetts. With the event, it begins in the home of the minister, of course. This is all that's left, where Reverend Parris had once lived, with the afflicted girls making their accusations. And with both of these accusations, we see that they're not going to fit prior witch hunt situations, not just because of gender. Most witch hunts picked on people who really were outsiders. For a myriad reasons, outsiders. People who didn't get along with the church, didn't get along with their family, people who others were envious of, things such as that. And neither Rebecca Nurse nor George Jacobs, even for the non-gender reasons, none of them would have fit the typical case. They're both kind of outliers. Here, Nurse is a respected member of the community, really had none of those factors in her background. Same with Jacobs. Jacobs' family has been around for ages. He has multi-generations. The family's cohesive. They get along. Not what you would have expected. So as we're moving to compare the accusations against them, Nurse will be accused before Jacobs. Not by a whole lot, but she will be. Her statement, and I point this out because we're going to see that Jacob says something pretty similar, is, "I am as innocent as the child unborn." The straightforward statement that she is entirely innocent of this accusation. Now, March is her accusation. I have her accusers and their ages. We do often kind of, as like America as a whole, kind of, I think, when you see it portrayed in TV programs or movies, really do assume that this is a group of young girls making accusations, which is not really the case. One of her prime accusers at the beginning is Mrs. Putnam, who's 31. Very much not a little girl. So Nurse goes to grand jury and trial in June. She is almost really acquitted, almost because of the fantastic defense of her family, but she is convicted in the end, and she's executed July 19th. Jacobs. With many of our witch hunt sites in Salem, Danvers, all these surrounding towns, we have a lot of photos that were taken in the 1890s by a guy with the last name Cousins, who did these great black and white photos. These pictures, this one is of course turned into like a postcard, which is why it is labeled. The collection was given to the Peabody Essex Museum, and they're all digitized. So you can go to their website and see them. And I remember once seeing the actual, one of their examples of his real glass negative of these, and it's like giant. And because of that, they are scanned at such high quality, you can zoom in so well and see all the details of these historic structures. There's one of the Rebecca Nurse Cemetery, and you can see houses like 3 streets away in the background and zoom in and see them. And it's fascinating. And he went to Jacob's house, and that's Jacob's descendant standing out front, showing him around, and he's going to take a bunch of photos. I only have a couple in here, but he kind of documents like the whole farm, which is amazing for preservation because in the 1890s, basically nobody had a camera. This guy's photos are like the only ones we have really of many of these places. So if he hadn't have done this, we just wouldn't have this like image record. So Jacobs is accused about a month and a half later. We got May 10th. He's accused alongside his granddaughter. When Nurse is accused, none of her household are accused, but she'll then have 2 sisters closely after her. So in both cases, they're not the only family member accused. His accusers are different, partly. You have a 20-year-old, 17-year-old, and then the 12 and the 11-year-old, the same as Rebecca Nurse. That's the same. He is accused specifically of being a dreadful wizard. And this phrase is repeated and repeated and repeated. And when we have the accusations from these accusers, it's kind of funny that they all use that same word. And it's kind of funny that Ann Putnam's father wrote all the documents. Those young women couldn't write. So Ann's dad wrote them, and boy, does it seem like he put his own words into those. They probably never said dreadful wizard, or one did, but he just wrote it in all the others because he thought it sounded good. So you always have to really, really take these with a grain of salt of who is writing them, because many of these people could not write them themselves. So who is that second person? What are they thinking? Like, what's their agenda here? And his quote is, "Well, burn me or hang me, I will stand in the truth of Christ. I know nothing of it," meaning I know nothing of witchcraft. Just like Nurse, really straightforward denial and claim of innocence. Well, our twist here is with Margaret. Margaret knows the accusers. She's in the same age group as the accusers. They're people from the village that she would have had contact with just being that age. They are both taken into downtown Salem, and they are examined, which means it's your first hearing before the judge. And it's done one at a time, separately. It's 2 separate cases, of course, like the judicial proceeding is separate. I have a quote here from one person, Joseph Flint, who was there in the building as this was happening, and he's kind of our real first-person perspective on this early part of the Jacobs case. Jacobs has his hearing. Cool, fine. He's off in the next room. He knows he's going to be sent to jail. He knows that, unfortunately, these people the judges believe this accusation against him. And he's not in the room when his granddaughter is, they say examined, we should really say questioned. So he's told by Flint that he told him that his granddaughter had confessed. He asked me what she had confessed. I told him that she confessed she was a witch and had set her hand to the devil's book. Whoa, all right, so our case has taken a total shift. Jacobs will be put on trial in August, and he will be executed in August. Margaret here testifies against George Jacobs at his trial. We are missing the real line-by-line testimony of what she said. We do not have every document. We have really a lot of documents. Like, we are really fortunate that we have so much paperwork about the witch hunt to study. This is not really something that we have. So we have here a letter from her. This is our primary source. She went to her grandfather in jail after he's convicted, partly based on her own testimony, to apologize. She recants to the judges and tells them that she lied at trial, that she lied in this evidence she submitted. And this is where we kind of get our glimpse at, well, of course we want to know, like, what did she say at trial? If we don't have the document, we want to kind of figure this out. And this is sort of our best example. And her main point is that she says she's scared into confessing from the other accusers. She says, I would not confess if I did not confess that they would put her into the dungeon and hang her. But if she did confess, I should have my life. Now, her recantation. What I said was altogether false against my grandfather. But the Lord, charging it to my conscience, made me in so much horror that I could not contain myself before I had denied my confession, choosing rather death with a quiet conscience than to live with such horror which I could not suffer. She is racked by guilt after her grandfather is convicted and thinks she cannot live with herself after what she's done. The end there about choosing rather death, she is quite sure that recanting her confession means she's going to be put on trial next and executed next. So she thinks she's sacrificing her life here to tell the truth. Of course, too late. But eventually, to tell the truth, she really does think that, like, she is going to end up killed for this letter, for sending this letter. Now, despite this, Jacobs is still hanged, even though some of the evidence is now more than in question, more than in doubt that it has actually been retracted. She also had testified against John Proctor. And she will meet with both of those men in jail, basically apologizing to them and telling them that she recanted. So she's also a witness against Proctor, who was on trial at the same time in early August and executed the same day, August 19th, 1692. So now the real heart of our setup here is how they're remembered later. Memorialization is a topic that has grown in the field of history. In particular, there's been more and more writing about the memorialization, not of necessarily like a glorious achievement or winning a war or a battle, but kind of memorializing errors. We see this, really one of the parts of like historical study of memorials that took off is like how the Holocaust is remembered, how different communities decided to design memorials, build memorials, or wait a really long time before they did. Some did early on. Really, that kind of gets people talking about memorials. And it has spread to any problem in history, any wrongdoing in history. So when we think of memorialization, one thing that I kind of wanted to be clear on is here I have, after 1692, the families petitioning the government to clear their names. Jacob's name, Rebecca Nurse's name, they will be cleared in the early 1700s. Their convictions are basically expunged. I don't consider that memorialization because the families are very self-interested in this. They're looking out here for their own reputations, and they all say that in the documents they send to Massachusetts. They're worried about their reputations. So it's not quite memorialization if you're doing it for yourself and not doing it, purely for the person who has suffered here. Here's a copy of when the Massachusetts legislature does eventually clear names here in 1711. You got Jacobs, you got Rebecca Nurse, you have many others, not everyone, but you have many of the others who are executed or convicted. Fine, not much happens later in the 1700s. Until we get to 1885 and the Nurse Monument, we have a gathering here, the people of Danvers, Rebecca Nurse's descendants, leadership of the First Church of Danvers, that was the church in Salem Village, dedicating this monument to her, which is the obelisk over there. I have a little program from the event. This is in the collections of the Rebecca Nurse House. You can see what they did, the people who came, people involved in the organization who are descendants from, yeah, of course, Danvers, around the corner. But you got one from Chicago, you got Binghamton, New York, these faraway places that are drawn to Nurse's memory that is incredibly impressive. That they accomplished this, it's impressive that the community rallies around it. It's the first monument, in theory, to any person who was executed for witchcraft in the Western world. They have Whittier write the inscription on the monument itself. This is one of those cousins photos I have here, that he came to take photos of that. And this is going to end up being unique to Nurse in that era, out of all the victims of the witch hunt. I have the Globe front page showing this as the main story. I have a couple examples of newspapers from around the world. We have Le Petit Journal writing about it in Paris. We have your German language newspaper out in Minnesota that's reporting on this, that it is a high-level worldwide news event. You also, as Nurse is memorialized, have this real moment of, it's very revealing. It's a very revealing moment between how in the 1880s Salem is dealing with this and how in the 1880s Danvers, formerly Salem Village, is dealing with this. And we have a great quote from the minister of the First Church of Danvers. The minister of the First Church of Salem is present. Now, that was the congregation that Rebecca Nurse had started her life in. She had grown up in downtown Salem, and so that's why he's invited out to Danvers. And what the minister from Salem says is kind of just some nice platitudes, really not meaningful in any sort of way. It's really forgettable. And then you have the minister of the First Church of Danvers, Rice. There is sufficient reason for our coming thus together today, or on any like occasion. The children of those who have suffered grievous injury in the former generations may properly take redress from mankind in the following ages. There is a public interest also, with every man demanding that public errors of the past should stand in the light and be reproved. That community is holding nothing back at this point. That they understand really wrong things happened, they are willing to face them, and they want it pointed out. Really, the idea is so we don't do things like this in the future is the goal. The idea that public errors should be pointed out. And it is kind of fascinating because there's a lot of literature, a lot of history that really describes the city of Salem as kind of coming to terms with the witch hunt before the Danvers community. And that really isn't the case here. What we're going to see is Salem is definitely the first to commercialize it. But they actually aren't in this level of meaning with this significance actually confronting the legacy. They won't have a memorial to the victims of the witch hunt in Salem until 1992. They had tried to build one for 1892, and it shot down. Wildly unpopular, huge pushback, and so the plans were scrapped. And so that, I think, is counter to how many people kind of think of this. So, Jacobs memorialization. We have a drawing here. This actually comes from one of our, back to cousins, taking a bunch of photos. It's actually better in the pen and ink drawing, though. This is published in 1892 in a book written by Nevins about the witch hunt. He just drew it from a photo. Yeah, the photographer actually had Jacob's descendants standing there. That guy with his hand out is pointing at exactly where George Jacobs is buried. No stone, there's no marker, there's no memorial. He's right there, but nobody cares. Nobody's doing anything about it. They never even give him any sort of grave marker. His name is not there. There's nothing. They just knew that it was right next to where these three fences came together. It was the corner of the family fields. Now, Jacobs is going to have kind of a rough time. He has a real rough time during the witch hunt, of course, leading to his execution. His remains his story is really not over. His remains are going to be treated in strange ways. He's dug up in 1854. His family is considering selling part of their farm. There's someone interested in buying it, but yet even the buyer knows George Jacobs might be buried there. Don't want to buy the field, George Jacobs. And so what they end up doing is they exhume him, which is way too nice of a word if they just dug him up. I mean, it's not exhume in a medical sense or an official sounding sense. They just dug the guy up. And they apparently found a fair amount. They described him as being in a good state of preservation, which I don't really want to know what that means. I'm not totally clear. They do have descriptions of what body parts are there and remains, and yeah, it's of course quite gross, naturally. But this itself is giant news. You have people down in Virginia writing, they found one of the witches, which is of course the phrase that they used for all of this, and that it's sensational that they had dug one up. It had not occurred. What they end up doing though is they decide like, oh yep, that's him. And they just put him back, and still no stone, still no memorial or any formal marker or anything like that. What's worse is you can see this jar here. Bones of George Jacobs. They took what are in theory a finger. Those are finger bones. They put it in a jar, and it was someone in Danversport, which is that section of Danvers, Salem Village that he lived in, who had written about the witch hunt, and whose family just like collected historical items and such. They had a beautiful brick mansion that's still at the Danversport corner in Danvers. It used to be a historic New England property. Fowler was his last name, and yeah, he had this little jar in his, curiosity cabinet in his living room. And he eventually passes away, and then his daughter lives there, and her daughter has it. She will pass away it's around 1910, 1912, and she leaves all of her, and really her father's, collection of books and collection of items about the witch hunt to the Essex Institute. And this was in Plummer Hall on Essex Street, in their, curiosity collection for pretty much all of the 1900s. It is still owned by the Peabody Essex Museum. It's still in a warehouse somewhere. It is not on display, but they still have this. I have seen a couple years ago photo of it. I mean, it does exist. The stopper is red wax that seals it in. For a while, there were no photos, and so somebody in the 1970s had gone to see it at the Essex Institute and drew this. For a while, this was the only image anybody ever had of it. It was secret somehow. And Jacob's exhumation, such as it is, really does draw interest into his case. We have the Essex Institute is going to get this painting, giant painting of the trial of George Jacobs. Tompkins Madison did 2 of these. There's one other one you might see of a woman in white with her hands raised, and there's lightning bolts. It looks really similar, the background is really similar to this. So he does these 2 as a pair. It's the trial of George Jacobs. This is hung in the main stairway of Plummer Hall, which was the main reading room of the Essex Institute at that point. Wicked prominent. Everybody who walked into that building, it's the first thing you would have seen straight ahead. Couldn't have better placement for a painting. They considered, the Essex Institute talked at some of their meetings about, well, we got this great painting. We have heard the story, should we get him a headstone? Should we try to build a memorial? But they don't. Nothing happens. Jacob's family still continues to live on their farm. They'll be living there up through the 20s. We're getting into the 30s. It's the same family, their descendants. My great-grandfather actually worked for Jacobs, the last Jacobs. He was just a farmhand for them in Danversport. I found that out after I put this presentation together, which was a fun little fact. Yeah, kind of interesting. And eventually the farm the last occupant passes away. And the farm is going to be sold. There's multiple children involved. Most of them have moved out of Danvers. They just don't need this farm. And so the family's possession of it is going to be over. And what happens is they're trying to line up an organization to buy it, to kind of preserve it. We're just starting to get to that, like, the possibility of historic preservation, which just, that's not the way people thought for most of American history. And the house will be struck by lightning and burn while it is empty. And so this is the picture of after it. You see at the bottom, this is from the Historic American Building Survey that is completed, or actually it's kind of the follow-up to it. During the New Deal, with so many people out of work, they had paid researchers to go document some of the oldest, most historic houses in America. So it was well documented, and then this was sort of the return visit after it had been burned and looking like that. But Nurse's family, with the last name Nurse, had left their farm in the 1780s. Later on, there are some of the people who live there, the last name changes to Putnam. Some of them do actually end up being Nurse descendants again. But that not the family doesn't have that presence, whereas the Jacobs family had a presence for so much longer. For Jacobs, he is going to first get his name carved on a monument in 1992, the Salem Village Witch Hunt Victims Memorial. It's on the walking tour, if you're interested in the walking tour. And between 1854, or I should really say, between his family leaving the farm in 1992, he has strange adventures. Sure, the house is burned. He's still buried on the farm. The farm sits for a while. We get to the 1950s, and you can think of all across, northern Massachusetts, all of the like suburban development and all of this. Well, it's a farm that's like abandoned. It'll be purchased. It'll be subdivided. It'll become a neighborhood. As you know, much of Danvers and all these surrounding towns has occurred. The problem is they find him again. They're digging a cellar hole, and they come up with a bunch of bones. Now you're going to call the police. You're going to, what do you do when you find a body where you're trying to build a house? And the police, immediately like, this is not a recent death. This is not a like crime that needs to be solved. It was really evident that this was a like historic burial. And with that, nobody knows what you do with them. There weren't, by that point, by the 50s, those descendants that had been around and living on that farm. They're not around. You can't really figure out who the like next of kin is or what you're going to do. You can't bury them there. It's going to be a neighborhood. What happens? And so he briefly is essentially in the custody of the town. They don't really know what to do. They give it to a cemetery in Danvers. In Danvers, there is no town-run cemetery. They're all private cemeteries. So there wasn't a obvious like burial spot. So it's this private cemetery, this nonprofit organization. They keep him for a while. They had this historic building. They still do. That's all granite, and that is where they sometimes of year it was too cold to do a burial, and that they would keep a body in this building until it was warm enough to bury them. Obviously, they don't use it anymore. But they kept him in there for a while, and then eventually the cemetery was, well, we don't really want this, skeleton in a box in our building. And so they pawn him off on somebody who had been involved with the Danvers Historical Society, a lawyer. It's a gentleman who had been involved, really instrumental in saving Endicott Park in Danvers from also being like subdivided in his role with the Historical Society. And he keeps this box with George Jacobs just in his house. He's a very nice house. And it's just under his dining room table in the 50s, in the 60s. And then eventually, he has to get rid of him. His household help, his maid in particular, is going to quit if he doesn't get that skeleton out of the house. That this is weirding people out. It is really strange. And so he has to get rid of him. It ends up kind of going through a couple people's hands. It winds up just in somebody's house in Danvers for kind of a while. He has strange appearances at events. Every Saturday morning, the Danvers Historical Society here, in like the 1970s, would run, not every Saturday, but like once a month on a Saturday, would have, it's not like a giant yard sale, but like an antique fair. that sort of a thing, in the cafeteria at Danvers High School. And every time they did it, they'd also have a table of like exhibit, of some actual local history items or something like that. And on one of these Saturday mornings, one of our high school cafeteria tables, they managed to borrow from the Essex Institute. You can't really borrow things from museums anymore, probably for a good reason. They had Judge John Hathorne's like letter bag, basically, his leather case that he kept papers. They had George Jacobs' canes, and they had George Jacobs on the high school table. That he was like mini little display, which is alarming in a lot of ways. I wouldn't want to eat there on Monday morning after that. But he's in a glass box, like on display. You could see his bones. Now, he continues to be in somebody's home for a while, and what ends up happening is it really him? Really, that's the main question. And this is before you could DNA test or any of the things that we in like 2025 could do fairly straightforwardly. They got a pathologist from Mass General to come out and examine the bones. And there's no written record, but it was tape recorded. So there is nothing on paper as to this. What happens is they're trying to confirm date, age, what about the bones? Can we compare to the historical George Jacobs to confirm it's him? Now, it's very weird. He's buried off on his own. This is strange. That's not really what the Puritan settlers would have done. You'd either, you would have been in a family cemetery. You could have been in the community cemetery, like the First Church has a cemetery in Danvers that has burials that predate him, so that was obviously an option for him. But to have one European settler buried alone, not how this works, typically. Very strange, very strange. So right away you know that there had to be some reason or something like that. You have the tradition that goes very far back that the family buried him there. Like, that all seems to work. Definitely seems to fit. The bones themselves are of somebody who are the right age as Jacobs, the right ethnicity. They appear to be from that right time period. That, again, I mean, when they investigated finding them, they immediately knew this was a historic burial, not a crime. Not a recent crime, I guess at least. And what they also notice is his leg bones. That it's somebody who had had really bad arthritis, and we have all these descriptions of him walking with his two canes that are in the PEM collection. And so every detail, the age, the location, his trouble walking, all of this really like configures into it must be him. In particular, the way that he's just randomly buried in a farm field is so exceptional here. And so we have the 99% sure, because you can never be 100% sure in that sort of a regard, that it is him. And when we come up to 1992, when this memorial is constructed, the 300th anniversary of the witch hunt, it's a moment where people again kind of start to realize, like, we should do something with him. He shouldn't be in a box in somebody's house. He's spent some time in the vault at the Danvers Archival Center and the Danvers Library. Like, this is not right. It is, I mean, to us, like, this is obviously wrong. There's obviously something really uncomfortable about that. And so in 1992, he will be eventually reburied, and he gets his headstone in the cemetery of the Rebecca Nurse homestead. That the museum knew that there was part of the cemetery, the fenced-in area that had no burials and was available, I guess. And they offered to take him and to have him buried there. With that, I can't imagine the paperwork involved of you can't bury someone with a death certificate. I don't know how you get across that. He's obviously dead, but you need the paperwork to legally do this, which sounds like a nightmare. And that really is what had delayed this, was the idea of the, like, how do you even do this? How do you even get permission to do a grave such as this? When he is interred, again, reinterred, I suppose, they will invite some descendants to come to the Rebecca Nurse homestead. They have a service that is not open to the public. It's just his descendants, the museum volunteers. They got the minister from the Baptist church in Danvers, which is not the Puritan church, but all of his later generations were really big members of the Baptist church. And so that was like the family. His last, the last relative to live on that farm had been for like decades the deacon of the church, like that they had been really important there. So they got him. It was a Puritan type service, of course, but that was the minister they had. He is then buried, and afterwards it becomes really big news that they'd wanted to keep the actual service respectful and quiet and such. But then so many people come later that year to visit his grave. It is a beautiful stone that does look so historically correct. And of course, you need to put his great quote at the bottom to make his innocence really clear. So finally, his mistreatment and injustice is righted, even though still at the end of the day, it is much more little and much more late than Rebecca Nurse. That you do still have, as you go into the cemetery, a pretty clearly unequal legacy between two people that were just as innocent as one another. So that's what I wanted to share with you this evening. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions, but I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Yeah, that was fantastic.
All right, we have questions with this little microphone. This is more for the benefit of people in the future listening to the recording than it is for here. So whenever you ask your question, please speak directly into the microphone, as I am doing.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Gagnon. So, by the 19th century, when there was this gradual exploration, by 19th century historians on the Salem Witch Trials, when the monument was, when the construction and ceremonial gathering to honor Rebecca Nurse with the creation of the monument, you mentioned you did mention something about when the suffragette movement began to really take shape. Did that play a role in more of focusing on applying the Salem Witch Trials to the ongoing women's struggle, and that focus more on the female victims?
Yes, not until after that moment of memorialization. With our Gage book that comes out in 1893, it really is after that. And that does become inspiration in the early 1900s in the women's movement. And it would be after that that it's the focus. Now, witchcraft, both before and after, everybody did kind of know was associated primarily with women. It doesn't really lead to that understanding, but it for the first time sees them as precursors to the women's movement, which in some ways is true, in some ways not necessarily. That some could have been progressive in their day. Many weren't, or were just average for their day. But that is kind of taken up as the idea, because there are some examples that would lead and encourage there.
Right, thank you.
On a few of the tours that I have taken, I had always understood that, at least the large hanging, that they didn't know what had been done with the bodies. So how come the family of Rebecca Nurse and Jacob Sr. had the remains? Did I misunderstand that? I honestly thought that they didn't know where the bodies were buried.
Yeah, so this is a good question, and I do think this is something that is talked about, and sometimes is kind of talked about in a way that's almost more confusing. So the idea is that probably bunches of families of the victims reburied them on their farms. We know that none of them are buried at the hanging site, so it's quite likely that they were recovered. I'm sure not every example. But knowing that most of these people, their family had defended them, had stuck up for them, that they would have then reburied him on their farm. There's no law against it. There was nothing wrong with that. We know that Jacob's family did, and they didn't even really defend him, and they still reburied him. The Nurse family had always said that that's where they started their cemetery around, is where Nurse was buried. John Proctor's family always had that he was buried in Peabody off of Lowell Street. He even in jail writes his will with directions on like how he wants his estate carried out, including burial. So there had been multiple rounds of executions before then. He would have known if that wasn't possible by August of 1692. With many of the other families, we have no record.
Okay, so actually we don't in the 21st century, but very likely the family, especially if they attended the hangings, followed and kept track, and those that were interested recovered the remains, and it's the ones that where they didn't have families that did so that we really don't know where they are. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it definitely is. And what kind of helps this, or further leads us to not know also, is that it's really just family cemeteries. They're not like documented. It's not through a church. It's not through an organization. There was no churchyard for the Puritans. That's a Catholic or an Anglican sort of concept, is you're buried in a joint graveyard right next to your parish church. The Puritans were just on your family farm. So you often hear like, oh, they weren't allowed a Christian burial. It's like, well, but everybody's just buried in a field on their farm. They were also. It doesn't actually slight them in any way. That's just normal for 1692.
So I don't know whether you are aware, but we're working with North Andover Middle School teacher Carrie Lapierre to continue her project with Elizabeth Johnson Jr. With her civic students. This year they are looking to find a location where we can build our own memorial to the witches in Andover in 1692. And it's been a really long process trying to understand where to build it. So looking back at the Danvers Memorial slide that you had, do you know what were the considerations when they determined where the location of that memorial will be, and was there resistance to it, and was that location connected directly to any of these stories of the injustices?
That's a great question. Yes. So in 1992, when this is built, it predates the one in downtown Salem. It had been planned first. It is completed first. And its location is near the center of Salem Village. But in particular, it's directly across the street from where the Salem Village Meeting House used to be. The Meeting House was torn down around 1700. It was long gone. It was not there. When they had torn it down, they kind of just left all of the extra lumber across the street, the side of the memorial. So it kind of had that connection. And in the Meeting House is, not just where the church met, of course, but it's also where those who were arrested in Salem Village had their initial hearings before the judges, basically like your bail hearing before the judges. So knowing that those proceedings, which are actually some of the best documented out of all of the judicial proceedings of the witch hunt, had occurred right there, that was what they had in mind when they constructed it. Now, the other part of the question about pushback, I wouldn't quite say so. It was an effort that had so many people behind it. It was entirely funded by donations. The town owned the land. They actually had bought the land. They were planning to build a high school there. And some people had initially thought, is this going to be in the way of the high school? That was sort of the only wrinkle. They never built a high school there, so it was totally fine. That was sort of the one, was how is that, what were the future plans already for it? Which isn't really a pushback against the memorial itself. It was just more of a logistical concern. And it really is important that that was a community effort. It was individuals, it was organizations like the Historical Society, the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, it was, the Rotary, the Kiwanis, the Lions Club, all of these groups of descendants that were involved that I'm with the Elizabeth Johnson connection, of course, that's a strong avenue. It was also people who, there were donations from people who had been involved in film about the witch hunt, like there's the movie Three Sovereigns for Sarah about the three sisters of the Breckeners, that the director had donated some money. I'm pretty sure they asked Vanessa Redgrave too. I don't remember if she was in on the donation list, but they definitely asked Vanessa Redgrave also. And that, I think, really helped. That sort of like coalition or community support really helped. And what's interesting is that's actually in great contrast to the Salem Memorial. The Salem Memorial is financed really primarily by the city. And the people, this one is designed by people in Danvers. The Salem one was, international competition. It was fully funded, and it really was much, much less a community effort. So it's kind of a whole different purpose, a whole different sort of construct there, that we kind of see two different ways to approach it. Have I fully answered your question? Or, okay, I was afraid I'd missed a part. And if I may ask a question, I don't think I actually knew that. Were there been suggestions for sites or ideas? I think that's fascinating, and of course, really important in this community that has so many who are accused.
Absolutely. So, as you probably know, Carrie Lapierre worked with her middle school students in 2021, and they actually got the State House to exonerate Elizabeth Johnson Jr. in 2022. Last year, she started working with her students in the 8th grade, trying to identify locations that may be good locations for the project. And it was mostly a civics project. So the students learned that, you need to get approvals, you need to get buy-in, you need to advocate for this, and then you have to start fundraising. So last year, they actually came up with 3 locations. They worked with an architect and a monument producer to identify, 3 options for the actual memorial itself, and then 3 locations in town that would be suitable. One of them was actually the triangle up on Academy Road next to the first burial ground, which actually is very, very close to where the original meeting house was. So that would tie in with what happened in Danvers. Another location is right next to the burial ground. There's a field pasture there. And then another location was at the Parson Barnard House, one of our properties, which had connections to the witch trial too. So through the process of last year, it was determined that these wouldn't get approval for various reasons. Another location was identified, which is actually behind the little white Hayscales building, which is on the corner of Andover Street and Osgood Street here on the Common. Seemed like it's a really good location. So this year they have to, approach the old Center Historic District Commission, of which this area is, go to the town and get the buy-in of the select board, and then start fundraising. So the project, although it's a year into this project and there's a new set of students that started in September, it's that we don't see the end of it yet. We're in the process of finalizing those decisions, getting the approval, and then fundraising for it. But it's a really exciting initiative, and I think it's long overdue for Andover, North Andover specifically, because this was the old center of Andover. And there are so many people since I've been here at the Historical Society that come from all over the country to trace their descendants to people who are accused in Andover of being witches, of having this injustice, and want to do something about it. So, it seems like we really need a place for them to visit and say, this is what represents what we've tried to do to correct this injustice of the past. And I think it's, personally, that's my opinion, I think it's long overdue. We're probably one of the later towns to actually do it.
Oh, that sounds excellent. Yeah, and with other towns, we got this in Danvers, there's the one in Salem. Some places had put up individual items. Susanna Martin has one up in, I'm going to mess up, I think it's Newbury. It was Newbury back then. I'm trying to think of what side of the town line it's on now. Saw John Proctor's descendants have a little rock on Lowell Street in Peabody. Those were sort of like way smaller scale, just individual. Oh, yes, of course. Yes, yes.
Yeah, just one more comment on that. So the original project was just to build a monument to Elizabeth Johnson because she was only finally exonerated this century. But then they started working with other people to try and, we've actually, the Historical Society here has formed a subcommittee helping them to support them achieve this. And then they learnt about all of these other accused witches, and it makes total sense to maybe have Elizabeth Johnson Jr. stand out in some way, but all of the names of the accused will be listed on the monument, so it gets bigger.
Yeah, I think that's actually much nicer to include them all. And I'm standing over here just so I can actually see with the light.
So an interesting question in my mind is, was it unusual that George Jacobs' family made a point of remembering where he was buried? Is that, I mean, to me, that's the fact that they could say, oh, you know, he's here, and they dug down, and he was.
Mm-hmm,
and they did it twice. So they were working hard to remember him. It's without a marker. So other families just sort of let it go? Is that, we don't know.
The reason that his still would have been remembered is because it's still his descendants on that field. With the Nurse family, with their descendants that really sold it in the 1780s, it's kind of just forgotten. You can tell in the cemetery where there's a few old graves, like one would be her, one would be her husband. We know at least one of her other sons has to be one of them. We just can't tell you which because they were just rocks. And so it's like, well, they knew. They absolutely knew. We have lost that. But whereas it's the same family, generation after generation, the same spot, that is something that could much more easily be passed down there. And certainly it's written down in 1854 when they find him. But prior to that, it was just family tradition since it's their descendants. Yeah, but you're right. The idea that they knew where he was and it's not like they intentionally forgot or didn't want to tell their kids or something like that.
My short question is, so when they first dug up his body and took the finger bones and then reburied him, when they dug up his body in the 1950s for the development, did they find that the fingers were missing and that would have supported the original?
That's a good question. When he is found in the 1950s, he's missing a bunch of bones.
So
It is not every bone. Again, it was like a backhoe that dug him up. So I
have a comment on that, actually, because I am an osteologist by trade. Well, in a previous life. Could we go back to that picture of the illustration of the two bones?
Oh, of course.
So, yes, because New English soil is so acidic that any unprotected bone will degrade very quickly. This one right here, this is not a finger. This is the back left of your lower jaw. So this is where your molars articulate.
Yeah.
This, I don't know. This looks like it could be the interior of a facial bone. But this is definitely the back left of a jaw. This does not look in any way like a finger to me.
That's good. That's good.
That's what I do.
How long does expect bones in New England soil to stay.
Well, if he's protected in a wood box, longer than if he wasn't. Within 200 years, if you are unprotected, a lot of your bone will degrade to in our soil to the point of being really hard to identify. But that also depends on local soil acidities, because we can have well-drained soils and we can have non-well-drained soils. So if you have a soil that's closer to a moving body of water or a lake, that is a better drained soil. It's going to be less acidic. But if you're in the middle of a field like that, I would imagine that that is probably a more acidic soil. So I'd probably also imagine that he was probably in a box.
He was in a box, and his farm is along the Danvers River. Mm-hmm. That's fascinating that you can pick that out.
Does anyone have any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
A round of applause for Dan again.